The morning air was crisp, and the sun had just begun to climb, casting soft rays across the porch of an old, weathered house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Every week, without fail, at exactly 7:30 am, an envelope would appear on the porch of Mr. Williams' home. This was no ordinary envelope. It was unmarked, with no sender's name, no return address, just a blank, white envelope with neat handwriting, addressed to him. At first, William had dismissed it as some harmless prank or perhaps a mistaken delivery. But as weeks passed, curiosity began to gnaw at him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. This was the third week in a row, and each time, the envelope was accompanied by a chill of unease. He would cautiously pick it up, his fingers trembling, and open it slowly, the silence of the morning accentuating the sound of paper crinkling. Inside, there was always something new, a photograph, a small note, or sometimes just a cryptic symbol. But this morning was different. This time, the envelope contained a photograph of a young woman, her face barely visible, half shrouded in shadows, with a single haunting phrase written on the back, "She's watching you." The words struck him like a slap to the face. Who was sending these, and why was he being targeted? The unease turned into dread, and for the first time, he felt a creeping sense of fear that had nothing to do with mere curiosity. Mr. William Harris was an elderly man in his mid-70s. A retired history teacher, he had spent the better part of his life in this modest house, surrounded by books, memories, and an air of solitude. His life had been relatively quiet since the passing of his wife, Margaret, 5 years ago. Since then, he had become more withdrawn, spending most of his days tending to his garden or reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair. William was a man of routine, a man who found comfort in the predictability of life. But the arrival of these mysterious envelopes had shattered that peace. William had always been skeptical of conspiracy theories and dark mysteries, but the strange occurrences were now forcing him to question everything he believed in. The envelopes were unsettling, but what truly gnawed at him was the fact that they were personal. Whoever was sending them knew something about his life, something he couldn't explain. He had no family left, no close friends, just his memories. But now, someone was watching him, someone who knew too much about him. Every time he glanced at the envelope, a memory would flicker, a shadow from his past creeping into the present. The identity of the sender was a mystery, and for William, it was a puzzle that needed solving. Was it someone from his past? A disgruntled former student? A family member of one of the many people he had taught over the years? Or was it something darker altogether? Whoever the sender was, they clearly wanted to get a reaction from William. The cryptic messages, the eerie photographs, they weren't random. They were targeted. They felt personal, like they were meant to provoke fear. As William tried to piece together the puzzle, he couldn't help but wonder if this was a ghost from his past, someone with a vendetta or some deep, unresolved anger. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that whoever was behind these messages seemed to know too much. His every move, his every routine was being watched. Whoever they were, they had power, they had knowledge, and they had a purpose. William had no idea who they were or what they wanted. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. The envelope sat on the porch, innocuous at first glance, but William felt his heart skip a beat as he stared at it. This wasn't just another random delivery, it was a direct threat, and as he reached down to pick it up, his fingers brushed against something cold. A chill ran down his spine. This time, something was different. He opened it, and as he pulled out the photograph of the young woman, his stomach turned. There, beneath her shadowed face, were the words, "She's watching you." William's hand trembled as he dropped the photo, the cold realization setting in. This was no longer a game. Whoever was sending these envelopes knew him in ways he couldn't understand, and their intentions were far from harmless. Who was she? And more importantly, why was she watching him? As the weight of the message sunk in, the house around him felt like it was closing in. The past, which he had long buried, was suddenly coming back to life. The game had just begun. For months now, the elderly man, William Harrison, had received a plain white envelope on his porch every Wednesday. It was always there when he stepped out for his morning coffee, carefully placed on the doorstep as if someone had taken great care to make sure it was unnoticed by passers-by. The envelopes never contained anything other than a single sheet of paper, always typed in the same font, with a brief and cryptic message. But the messages were always enough to unsettle him. They didn't make sense, and with each passing week, his anxiety grew. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A minor curiosity, an odd but harmless prank. But the consistency and the increasing sense of dread began to gnaw at him. William, once a vibrant man, now a frail figure nearing his late 70s, had become increasingly withdrawn. The loss of his wife 2 years ago had forced him into a quieter life, one without the laughter and the companionship of his younger days. His days now consisted of quiet solitude, sipping tea in front of the TV, tending to his small garden, and reading in the evening. Yet each Wednesday, his heart would race when he saw the envelope, and he'd find himself pacing the house in frustration and confusion. It was becoming harder to ignore the mounting sense of being watched, of someone knowing things about him that no one should. Mentally, William's mind was spiraling. He was already a man prone to bouts of depression, especially after losing his wife, and these mysterious letters were only worsening his already fragile state of mind. He'd stop in the middle of his morning routine, staring at the unopened envelope for hours, torn between curiosity and fear. What could it possibly mean? And more troubling, why now? He had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years without any issues. Why was he being singled out? Each letter felt like a piece of a puzzle that was deliberately designed to torment him, but each time he tried to make sense of it, the answers slipped further from his grasp. The messages began to take on a darker tone, each one more ominous than the last, slowly stripping away his sense of security. He felt the walls closing in, unable to escape the sensation that something or someone was manipulating him from afar. Physically, William's health had begun to decline. The stress of the envelopes, paired with his mounting anxiety, had affected his sleep patterns. He would wake in the dead of night, his heart racing, feeling an overwhelming sense of terror as if the shadows of the room were closing in on him. He had once been an active man who would walk his dog around the block, but now even the idea of stepping outside his house was met with dread. His once calm and measured approach to life had been replaced with a constant state of unease. He didn't know who to trust anymore, or who might be watching him. The world outside had become increasingly threatening. Emotionally, the letters had tapped into something deeper within him. They reawakened fears he had thought long buried, fears about the safety of his home, the sanctity of his privacy, and the fear of facing death alone. The weight of loneliness pressed against him, reminding him daily of the void left by his wife. The mystery of the letters, coupled with his isolation, stirred something deep within him, a primal fear of being helpless, forgotten and exposed. He had once been an influential man, known and respected in his community. Now he was an old man, vulnerable to the world's unpredictability and at the mercy of a faceless threat. Despite the growing dread, William couldn't simply let it go. He tried to rationalize the letters. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was a mistake. He'd even considered reaching out to his son, but the last time they spoke was months ago, a strained conversation filled with unspoken tension. His son had always been busy, always away on business, and William didn't want to be a burden. So he kept the mystery to himself, slowly becoming more consumed by it. In a desperate attempt to maintain some control over his life, William took matters into his own hands. He began keeping a journal of the letters, carefully recording every detail he could remember. What day they arrived, what time he first spotted them, and the contents of each message. The cryptic lines became a puzzle he could no longer avoid. He was determined to understand them, to stop the gnawing fear before it consumed him completely. The struggle William faced was both internal and external. Externally, the mysterious letters continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Internally, he was locked in a battle between trying to hold onto his sanity and being slowly consumed by the terror of not knowing what would come next. His mind was torn, his body weary, and his spirit fragile. Yet, despite all the confusion and growing fear, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. These letters were not going to stop until he faced whatever or whoever was behind them. The person behind the letters had been watching William for months, carefully orchestrating every step. They knew about his past, his vulnerabilities, his deepest fears. It wasn't just an anonymous threat, it was personal. Each letter seemed designed not just to terrorize but to break him. The antagonist, whose identity remained shrouded in secrecy, had a clear objective: to isolate William, to push him to the edge of his mental endurance, and ultimately, to force him to make a choice that would change everything. This was no random act of malice. The antagonist was calculating, patient, and methodical. Each letter was a deliberate move in a psychological game, manipulating William's emotions with precision. They had studied him, learned his habits, and understood his weaknesses. The vague yet menacing tone of the messages targeted William's deepest insecurities, his loneliness, and his fear of death. By sending him cryptic warnings and threatening insinuations, the antagonist kept William on edge, never letting him find peace. Physically, the antagonist had also crossed boundaries. They had been following William, leaving small traces that he had not noticed at first. A slight rearrangement of his garden tools, a shadow flickering outside his window in the dead of night. These small, invasive actions weren't meant to be noticed immediately, but over time, they began to eat away at William's sense of safety. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, never fully certain if he was being watched. The antagonist's influence was subtle yet ever-present. Emotionally, the antagonist's manipulation was far more insidious. Each letter played on William's fears, pushing him further into isolation. The longer William remained in this psychological trap, the harder it became for him to trust his own mind. The antagonist had tapped into his sense of abandonment, playing on the pain of losing his wife and the void that remained in her absence. They knew that William's grief was still raw, still fresh, and they used it against him. But the true nature of the antagonist's motivations remained unclear. Were they seeking revenge? Was there a personal vendetta? Or was it something more twisted, a desire to watch someone break down, to unravel a life with cold precision? The mystery surrounding the antagonist deepened with each passing week, adding to the tension that had already gripped William's life. The antagonist was in control now. William had become the pawn in a cruel game, and each move he made only brought him closer to a terrible revelation. It was a battle of wills, and so far, the antagonist was winning. William's mind was a storm of confusion, doubt, and fear. Every letter that arrived deepened his inner turmoil, and with each new message, he found himself slipping further into a maze of paranoia. His thoughts no longer followed a clear path. They were disjointed, scattered like broken pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. The weight of the unknown was unbearable, and it seemed like every waking moment was consumed by the mystery. Could the letters be a warning? Was someone out to get him? And why him, of all people? The uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly. The more he thought about it, the more isolated he became. William's once peaceful home now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sending a wave of anxiety through him. He could no longer step outside without feeling a watchful eye on him. What had once been a quiet, secure existence was now filled with the terror of being hunted, and yet he couldn't bring himself to do anything about it. He didn't know who to turn to, and his pride kept him from reaching out for help. He couldn't even bear the thought of involving his son, knowing how little they spoke lately. The distance between them had grown, and in his fear, William found himself withdrawing even more. He was losing touch with everything: his relationships, his sense of security, his sanity. The letters didn't help, of course. They kept coming, each one more cryptic than the last. Some hinted at past mistakes. Others referenced things he could never have expected anyone to know. They felt like intimate blows, designed to make him question everything, even the very fabric of his past. The final straw came one morning when the letter contained a disturbing image, a photo of his front door. The message, written in bold, unsettling letters, read, "You are never alone." That was the moment when the weight of the situation hit him fully. Someone had been watching him. Someone knew things he didn't even know about himself. His breaths became shallow. His hands trembled as he clutched the paper. Was this the work of a neighbor, or was it something far worse, a stranger lurking just outside his view? The realization that he could trust no one, not even the very walls of his own home, sank into his chest like a lead weight. It wasn't just about the letters anymore. It was about his life unraveling in front of him. Just when William thought he couldn't sink any deeper into despair, the unthinkable happened. One night, as he sat at his kitchen table, the lights flickering ominously above him, he heard a faint knock at the door. It was a sound that echoed in the silence of the house, sharp and intrusive. At first, he froze. The knock was soft but distinct, and it felt wrong, deliberate, almost mocking. The same feeling from the letters rushed back to him. He crept toward the door, heart racing, hand gripping the knob so tightly his knuckles turned white. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the door, only to be met with the most shocking sight: nothing. There was no one standing on the porch, just the cold night air and the eerie silence that enveloped the house. Yet there, on the doorstep, lay a new envelope. This time, it was different. It wasn't plain white, but a deep crimson red, and the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was his own. In that instant, all his fears solidified into one cold, stark reality. Someone had been inside his house. They had been watching him so closely, so intimately, that they knew his every move, his every reaction. And now, they had crossed the line, taking things to a new level. The nightmare was real, and it was just beginning. The weight of the past few weeks finally culminated in a single devastating moment that would forever alter William's life. After the mysterious envelope had arrived on his doorstep, he spent sleepless nights trying to make sense of the new evidence, of the overwhelming sense of danger that seemed to be closing in around him. The once comfortable life he had known had disintegrated into a maze of fear and uncertainty. But now, there was no more running from the truth. The letters had escalated to something far darker than William could have ever anticipated. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to lead him deeper into a nightmare, and his fear had only grown. He had tried to fight it, to hold on to the idea that he could just leave it all behind and continue on with his life. But the truth was inescapable. It was as if the universe had conspired to push him to this breaking point, to force him to confront something that had been buried deep in his past. That night, William found himself staring at the final letter, the crimson one that had sent chills down his spine. The words inside were chillingly familiar, but the image that accompanied the message was the real shock. It was a photograph of a man standing in the shadows of his own house. And the man wasn't a stranger, it was William himself, but from years ago. A younger version of him, standing at the same doorstep, looking out into the dark. The picture was a sign, a clear indication that someone knew something about him that even he couldn't fully comprehend. It was a revelation that cut deep into his soul. For years, William had buried his past, choosing to live as a man with no history, no regrets. But now, he was being dragged back to confront it all, his decisions, his mistakes, and his demons. He could no longer ignore the fact that there were people who held power over him, people who knew the secrets that haunted him. And worse, they had the ability to manipulate his every move. The fear that had been gnawing at him began to shift into something darker, something more dangerous. It was the realization that his own past was catching up with him, and there was no way to outrun it. It was then, in the silence of his home, that the phone rang. William's pulse raced as he answered, half expecting to hear the voice of a stranger threatening him. But instead, it was a familiar voice, a voice he thought he'd never hear again. It was Michael, his estranged brother, the very person he had spent years trying to forget. The brother he had abandoned, whose life was now irrevocably tied to the mysterious events unfolding around him. "William," Michael's voice cracked, the tension clear even through the phone. "We need to talk." In that moment, everything came crashing down on William. The phone call, the photo, the letters, it all connected. The man in the photograph was no stranger at all. It was Michael, standing in the shadows of his own home, just like William had done years ago. The moment of realization hit him like a freight train. His family's dark secret was no longer a thing of the past. It was alive, and it was threatening to consume them both. The truth was here, staring him in the face, and William was faced with the harshest decision of his life. Would he continue to ignore the past, running from the very people who had shaped him, or would he confront the ghosts that had haunted him for so long? As the phone call continued, William felt his resolve waver. Michael's voice, filled with regret and fear, tugged at his heart. Was it possible that everything he had feared about his family, the lies, the betrayals, the darkness, was connected to the threat that was now closing in on him? The decision he faced wasn't just about his own survival. It was about the fate of his family, his brother, and perhaps even his own redemption. But the moment of decision was slipping away. Time was running out. William had to choose. Would he stand up and face his past, or would he let it destroy him and everyone he loved? The emotional weight of the situation bore down on William as the truth settled into his chest like a brick. His past had always been something he could hide from, something he could avoid with the passing of time. But time had run out. The letters, the photograph, the phone call. It all led to this crucial point. There was no more pretending that everything was fine, no more hiding from the darkness that had always lurked in the corners of his life. He had built his life on a series of lies, lies about who he was, lies about who his family was, and lies about the choices he had made. He had buried his past so deep that he convinced himself it no longer mattered. But now, everything was coming to light, and William was forced to confront the truth head-on. As he stood in his living room, looking at the photograph of his younger self standing on the doorstep, the weight of his decision hit him. Would he continue down the path of secrecy and denial, or would he confront the painful reality of his past? Could he reconcile the man he had become with the mistakes he had made? And what about his brother? Could he ever rebuild the relationship that had been broken for so long? The stakes were higher than they had ever been. It was no longer about his own survival. It was about the survival of everything he had ever cared about. His family, his past, his future. All of it hung in the balance. And in that moment, William knew that whatever choice he made, it would define the rest of his life. The tension in his chest tightened. He had always been a man of action, quick to make decisions, but now he felt paralyzed. The weight of the past, the weight of his mistakes, all crashed down on him, threatening to consume him. But there was no more time for hesitation. He couldn't run anymore. He had to face his past. And as the seconds ticked by, William realized that he couldn't keep running. It was time to confront the demons of his past and finally make a choice that would change everything. The room was cold, the silence deafening. William stood there, facing the man who had been both his greatest fear and his only tether to a past he could no longer ignore. Michael, his brother, was standing in front of him, his face a mask of guilt and regret. There was no hiding anymore. The truth had come to light, and now it was time to face the consequences. William's heart raced, his breath shallow. His hands trembled, not just from fear, but from the realization of how much he had lost. Over the years, he had convinced himself that severing ties with his brother had been the right choice, that walking away from everything he once knew was the only way to survive. But as he looked into Michael's eyes, he saw not just a man who had once been his family, but a man who was fighting his own battle with the past, a battle that mirrored his own. "I never wanted this." Michael's voice cracked, his eyes welling with unshed tears. "I never wanted to drag you back into all this. I thought I was protecting you. But I can't keep running. We can't keep running." The words hit William like a physical blow. He had spent so many years fighting to keep the pain of his past locked away, to pretend that the life he had built was enough. But it wasn't. It had never been. The walls he had built to protect himself had only kept him isolated, trapped in a cage of his own making. And now, standing here with his brother, his family, he felt the full weight of what he had lost. The phone call, the photographs, the letters. It had all led to this moment. The truth was inescapable. Michael was not just a part of the past that William had left behind. He was the key to understanding everything. Every piece of the puzzle that had haunted William's nightmares now made sense. The darkness that had clouded his mind was being pushed aside, revealing the harsh reality of the choices he had made. But even as the truth began to settle in, another realization hit William like a thunderclap. He had a choice to make. In that moment, standing before his brother, he could choose to continue his life in the same way, running from the truth, from his past, or he could choose to fight for what was left. For his family, for his own redemption. William's voice faltered. He wanted to say so much, but the words wouldn't come. His emotions were a tangled mess of anger, sorrow, and regret. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the choice in front of him. He could no longer avoid the truth, nor could he ignore the bond that had always tied him to his brother. With a deep, shuddering breath, William made his choice. "I'm not running anymore. We face this together. Whatever it takes, I'm not going to lose you again." The room felt warmer, the air less oppressive. There was still so much to be done, so many unanswered questions, but for the first time in years, William didn't feel alone. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he knew that whatever happened, he would fight for it. He would fight for his family. He would fight for himself. And in that moment, as the weight of his decision settled into his chest, William realized that the struggle was far from over. But he was no longer afraid. The weight of William's decision settled on his shoulders as the events he had set into motion began to unfold. When he had chosen to confront the truth, to face the past alongside his brother, he had no idea how deep the ramifications would run. But now, as he stood in the dimly lit room, watching the police car pull up outside, he could feel the storm brewing. The aftermath of his actions was unavoidable. The confrontation with his brother had been only the beginning. William had made a choice, a commitment to stand by Michael, but the world around him wasn't so forgiving. The lies, the betrayal, the years of running, it was all coming to a head. The truth, once buried so deeply, had risen to the surface, and there was no turning back. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his lawyer. "The press is already here. They know everything." William's stomach churned. The decision he had made to finally reveal the truth had sent shockwaves through the community. His name, once synonymous with success and integrity, was now tied to scandal, to the dark secrets he had spent years hiding. He hadn't anticipated the fallout. The whispers, the stares, the judgment from the very people who had once respected him. It was all happening now. His every move was under scrutiny, and the past that he had worked so hard to bury was now an open wound, exposed for the world to see. Michael, too, was facing the consequences of his actions. As the police officers entered the room, William saw the fear in his brother's eyes. Michael had known that this day would come, but seeing it unfold in real time was something he hadn't prepared for. The years of hiding, of running from the law, had led them here, together, standing in the ruins of everything they had once known. "You knew this was coming," William whispered to Michael, the weight of his words heavy in the air. Michael didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, his face pale, as if the magnitude of their situation was sinking in. The detectives approached them, their expressions unreadable. The moment of confrontation had arrived. William had hoped, for just a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. But deep down, he knew there was no escape from the choices they had made. As the officers began to question Michael, William's mind raced. He replayed the past months in his head, wondering if there had been any way to avoid this moment. He thought about the lies he had told, the secrets he had kept, and the people he had hurt along the way. He had hoped that by confronting his brother, by finally choosing the path of truth, he could fix everything. But now, standing on the precipice, he realized that some actions could not be undone. The consequences were far-reaching. Michael's arrest, the public outcry, the damage to his reputation, it all stung. But perhaps the hardest part was the feeling of betrayal that lingered in the air. For so long they had been two brothers united by blood, bound by the same dark history. But now, everything had changed. The truth had torn them apart, exposed the raw, painful reality of what they had both been hiding from for so long. As the police led Michael away, William watched, unable to move. The weight of his choices was crushing him, suffocating him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had wanted redemption, a chance to make things right. But now, as he stood alone in the room, he realized that some wounds never fully heal. The damage had been done. The decisions made in a moment of desperation had set into motion a chain of events that could not be reversed. The consequences were here, and there was nothing left to do but face them. Meanwhile, the truth about Michael's actions, his motivations, his involvement in the criminal activities, was coming to light. The public's perception of him was rapidly shifting. He was no longer just William's estranged brother. He was the man behind the schemes, the one who had manipulated and deceived not only his own family but countless others. As the detectives continued their investigation, more details emerged. Michael's involvement in the criminal underworld was more extensive than anyone had realized. His actions, driven by a mix of greed and desperation, had pulled him deeper into a web of lies and deceit. But it wasn't just the illegal activities that shocked everyone. It was the revelation of Michael's true motivations, the twisted reasons behind his actions. He had always felt overshadowed by William, always trying to live up to an ideal that was unattainable. The jealousy, the resentment, the need to prove himself, it had all boiled over into a series of reckless decisions that had led them to this point. Michael's story was one of internal struggle, of a man who had become so consumed by his own insecurities that he had ultimately destroyed everything he cared about. For William, the exposure of Michael's motivations was both a relief and a burden. On one hand, he understood why Michael had made the choices he did. On the other, it only deepened the pain. Michael's actions had been driven by a need for validation, a desire for recognition that had cost him everything. And now William was forced to reconcile the man he thought he knew with the man who had betrayed him. As the fallout continued to unfold, the full impact of their actions began to hit home. The consequences of the decisions made in the heat of the moment were now shaping their futures in ways neither of them could have anticipated. For William, the path forward was uncertain. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The damage had been done, and now it was time to live with the consequences. As the sound of the police car faded into the distance, William stood motionless, staring at the door that had just closed behind his brother. His hands trembled at his sides, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but the emotional fallout was overwhelming. The surge of emotions, guilt, regret, fear, and anger was suffocating him, each one threatening to drown him in a tide of overwhelming realization. His heart ached, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full depth of his pain. Watching Michael being taken away was a visual representation of everything he had lost, not just the trust between them, but the sense of security he had once held onto so tightly. He had always believed that his brother, despite his flaws, was a part of his foundation. They had shared a bond, built on years of shared history and familial love. But now, that bond had shattered, reduced to a painful fracture that could never be repaired. William's thoughts spiraled, each one pulling him deeper into a sea of doubt. Had he made the right choice? Was revealing the truth worth the destruction it had caused? Michael was no longer the person he had once known. He was now the embodiment of everything William had feared. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. The grief William felt wasn't just for the loss of his brother, but for himself. He had chosen to confront the past, to expose the truth that had been haunting them both. But now, he was left with nothing but the jagged remnants of a fractured family. His entire identity had been wrapped around the belief that he could fix everything, that he could somehow repair the damage Michael had caused, and in doing so, fix himself. But now that belief seemed naive, even foolish. He walked over to the kitchen counter, his legs heavy as if each step took more effort than the last. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window above the sink. It was a face he didn't recognize, one lined with stress and loss. He had tried so hard to keep everything together, to maintain the facade of a successful, in-control individual. But now that mask had cracked, revealing the person beneath, a man struggling with his own failures and the consequences of his actions. His chest tightened, and William's breath came in ragged gasps. How had it all gone so wrong? He closed his eyes, trying to push the overwhelming feelings away, but they surged forward with an intensity he couldn't fight. The image of Michael being arrested, the cold look in his brother's eyes, burned into his mind. That look, was it resentment, or was it a silent plea for understanding? William didn't know, but it haunted him. For the first time, he understood the depths of what Michael had been through, the insecurities, the struggles, the need for validation that had driven him to the brink. And now, William saw that their lives had been like two parallel paths, each heading in the same direction, but ultimately leading to different outcomes. Michael had chosen a path of destruction, while William had tried, and failed, to escape his own demons. They were both prisoners of their own choices, and now they both had to face the consequences. As the minutes ticked by, William felt a heavy sadness wash over him. It was the kind of sorrow that didn't have a clear source. It wasn't just the loss of his brother, but the loss of everything he had once believed in. He was left with nothing but a hollow ache in his chest, the echo of a dream that had died with Michael's arrest. Yet, beneath all the pain, a flicker of clarity began to form. His transformation was not just one of grief, but of realization. This moment, this loss, this devastation, was a turning point. William knew that, despite the crushing weight of his emotions, this was the beginning of his own journey toward healing. It wasn't the end, but it was the first step in reclaiming his life, in finding who he truly was, beyond the mistakes of the past. He exhaled deeply, the first steady breath he had taken in what felt like forever. His emotions, raw and unfiltered, were a storm inside him, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel them. There was pain, yes, but also a sense of understanding, a glimpse of the person he might become as a result of all this turmoil. And as the realization set in, he could feel a quiet, powerful shift within himself, a shift that marked the start of his own redemption. As the final days of the trial approached, William found himself in an unfamiliar state of peace. The whirlwind of emotions that had consumed him for so long, the guilt, the doubt, the grief, had finally started to settle. It was as though the resolution he had longed for was slowly falling into place, piece by piece, like a puzzle finally coming together after years of chaos. The courtroom, once an intimidating place where the weight of truth and consequence hung in the air like a suffocating fog, now felt less oppressive. The judge had already heard the testimonies, the defense and prosecution had made their final arguments, and now it was time for the decision. Michael's fate was no longer in his hands, and though it pained him to accept, he knew that the justice system would soon provide the closure he had been desperately seeking. The moment of resolution didn't come with fireworks or dramatic speeches. It was quieter than William had expected. The guilty verdict for Michael wasn't a victory. It was a confirmation that the truth had finally come to light, and that the consequences of their actions would now be faced. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the verdict was read. The once chaotic, tumultuous path was now complete. Michael was held accountable for his choices, but it wasn't the triumph William had imagined. There was no celebration, no feeling of vindication, just the reality that a new chapter had begun. But even in the somber silence, there was a sense of justice in the air. Michael's arrest and the subsequent trial had exposed the truth for what it was. William knew that his brother had been given the opportunity to come to terms with his actions, to face the consequences of a life lived in deceit and destruction. While Michael's punishment was a hard reality to swallow, William took comfort in knowing that at least there was some measure of justice for the victims and for himself. Through the entire ordeal, William had learned that justice was not always about the grand moments of victory or loss. It was about the quiet assurance that the truth had been revealed and that the pieces of their broken lives could begin to heal. William may not have been able to fix everything, but he had done the right thing, and that in itself had become its own form of resolution. As the months passed, the transformation in William was undeniable. He had once been consumed by the idea of fixing everything, the broken relationships, the family history, the image of himself he had desperately clung to. He had been a man trapped between guilt and responsibility, struggling to carry the weight of his family's mistakes on his own shoulders. But now, after the trial, after everything that had unfolded, there was a new clarity to him. He was no longer the man who sought to mend others at the cost of his own peace, no longer driven by the need to fix every broken thing around him. William had found a new sense of balance. The strength he had uncovered through his emotional struggles was something he had never known he had. The decision to expose the truth, no matter how painful, had shaken him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Where once he had been vulnerable, teetering on the edge of despair and hope, now he stood firm, knowing who he was and what he stood for. He had faced his own fears, and in doing so, had liberated himself from the burden of lies and guilt. It wasn't about being invincible. It was about accepting his imperfections, his mistakes, and the consequences of his choices. William's journey had led him to an understanding of his true self, one who could accept both his flaws and his strengths. He had learned that sometimes it was necessary to break in order to rebuild, to let go of old dreams and embrace new ones. The man who had once been torn between fear and hope had now become someone who could stand on his own, no longer driven by the need for external validation. As he looked out over the city skyline, a sense of calm washed over him. His life was far from perfect, but he had learned to live with the imperfections. He had learned that the path to redemption wasn't paved with grand gestures or complete fixes, but with the quiet acceptance of who he was. He had found peace not in the resolution of the external world, but in the reconciliation of his own heart. For the first time in a long while, William felt free, not in the sense of freedom from his past, but in the sense that he had finally forgiven himself. He was no longer bound by the past or the weight of others' expectations. In this moment, he understood that his journey wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about learning to embrace the imperfect journey itself. The trial was over, but his journey had just begun. And for the first time in a long time, William was ready to face whatever came next with the strength and clarity he had earned. The final scene unfolds on a quiet evening, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the city that William had once known as a place of struggle. Now it felt different, more like a canvas waiting to be painted, rather than a backdrop to his tumultuous past. He walked through the familiar streets, his footsteps steady and sure, each one representing the journey he had traveled, each one marking a step toward peace. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had learned that true healing didn't mean erasing the past, it meant accepting it, understanding it, and moving forward with the lessons it had taught him. As he reached the edge of the park, where he and his brother Michael used to play as children, William paused, taking in the peacefulness around him. The laughter of children in the distance, the rustling of the trees in the breeze. It all felt so different now. The world was no longer a place of constant struggle for him, it was a place of possibilities. The weight of guilt that had once shackled him had been lifted, not through the absence of mistakes, but through the acceptance of them. His eyes reflected a sense of peace that had been hard-won through struggle and heartache. William sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply be. He watched the people around him, couples holding hands, children playing, the world moving forward in its quiet rhythm. He had been so focused on the past, on the what-ifs, and the could-have-beens, that he had almost forgotten how to be present in the now. The journey had changed him, shaped him into a man who no longer looked back with regret, but forward with hope. The choices he had made, though difficult, had brought him to this moment of clarity. He wasn't just a man who had faced tragedy and loss. He was a man who had learned to live in the aftermath, to find joy and meaning in the simplest of moments. The conflict within him had been resolved, not by changing the past, but by changing the way he viewed it. As the sky turned from orange to purple, William stood up, taking one last look at the park. It felt like a full circle had been completed, a chapter closed. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. He walked away, his steps lighter than they had been in years, ready to embrace the future with the wisdom he had earned. Viewer engagement call to action. As the screen fades to black, the gentle hum of music begins to rise, inviting the audience to reflect on William's journey. The screen lights up once again with a question, lingering there for a moment, urging the viewer to consider their own experiences. Have you ever found yourself at a crossroads, faced with choices that would change the course of your life? How did you find the strength to move forward? We'd love to hear your thoughts. A soft pause fills the space before the call to action appears on the screen. If you found William's story inspiring and meaningful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming journeys like his. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation. Remember, every journey is unique, but we all find strength in the stories we share. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next chapter.